Before history had names, a child lived in a world that was not yet ours, but not completely separate from us either. Around that child, the land was cold, wide, and unfinished in the human story. Small groups moved between valleys, caves, forests, and open ground, carrying fire, hunger, memory, and fear in their bodies. We often imagine ancient humans as separate lines, each group walking alone through time. But in that older world, the distance between one humankind and another may not have been as simple as our drawings make it seem. A child could belong to more than one story at once. And if that was true, then maybe the mistake was not in the child, but in the way we imagined evolution itself. Why did one child make human evolution look wrong? Before anyone drew maps, before anyone wrote names for rivers or mountains, there were human lives moving through a world that did not know it was ancient. The ground was not a museum. The cave was not a discovery waiting for scientists. The valley was not a scene from the past. It was simply home, shelter, or a dangerous path between one season and the next. Somewhere in that older world, a child breathed cold air, heard adult voices nearby, felt hunger come and go, and belonged to a human landscape wider than any single family. Around that child, the land held forests, open grass, stone slopes, animal trails, and the long silence of places where few people ever walked. Human groups were small, distances were large. A river, a ridge, a frozen plain, or a dark belt of trees could separate one group from another for a long time. Yet separation was not the same as complete isolation. Ancient people followed food, warmth, water, safety, and memory. They moved because bodies had to move. They waited because seasons forced them to wait. They returned because some places mattered. In such a world, the beginning of humanity was not a straight road, but a slow spread of bodies through changing land. The child at the center of this story did not live inside a diagram. The child lived inside weather, hunger, touch, danger, and kinship. That matters because the question of why one child made human evolution look wrong begins before the child is ever studied. It begins in the old world itself, where the lines between human groups were drawn by distance, climate, and survival, not by the clean categories we use today. We often imagine early humans as if each kind had its own separate path. One group here, another group there, each one moving forward in its own lane. It is a picture that helps the mind rest, because it gives order to a past that was never simple. But the old land did not obey that picture. Mountains did not know where one humankind ended. Forests did not protect neat boundaries. Cold did not care about names. A shelter that held one group in one season might hold another group in another season. A valley used by one people for animals, stone, or water might later draw another people for the same reasons. In the deep beginning of the human story, movement was not just travel, it was survival written into the body. Feet had to cross ground. Hands had to carry food, tools, and children. Eyes had to read the sky, the tracks, the distance, the signs of danger. Over many generations, these movements created chances for separation, but also for meeting. The meeting did not need to be grand. It did not need to change the whole world in one moment. It only needed to happen between real bodies in a real place. That is why the child matters. Not as a strange exception placed outside history, but as a small life that may have stood inside hidden crossings of history. The child makes the simple picture tremble because a child is never only an idea. A child comes from parents, from groups, from places where lives touched. If those lives belong to human groups we once imagined as separate branches, then the old branch drawing begins to feel too quiet, too clean, too far from the ground. The world around that child was not a world of perfect divisions. It was a world of edges, forest edges, river edges, cold edges, migration edges, and fragile social edges where one human group could become aware of another. Some meetings may have been rare. Some may have left no trace we can recognize. Some may have disappeared completely, swallowed by time, weather, and bodies never preserved. But one child asks us to slow down before we decide what ancient humanity was supposed to look like. The question is not whether the past should fit our drawing. The question is, what kind of world could produce a child who belonged to more than one human story, and why that child made human evolution look wrong? To imagine the child clearly, it helps to remove the glass case from the mind. There is no label beneath the body, no number, no modern room, no hand turning ancient matter into evidence. There is only a living place, with cold passing through trees and stone, with smoke held low under rock, with people listening for animals and weather. A child in that world was not an answer to a scientific question. A child was warmth beside another body, a small mouth needing food, a fragile life carried through seasons that did not forgive weakness for long. The adults nearby may have known paths through the land, places where water could be found, places where animals crossed, places where stone broke well enough to make useful edges. They may have known shelters, winds and valleys worth returning to when hunger pressed too closely. The child belonged to those ancient needs before belonging to any category in our minds. In the deep human beginning, identity was not written as a species name. It was lived through the group that fed you, guarded you, moved with you, and remembered where to go. A young life could be held inside a small circle of care, while the larger world around that circle remained uncertain and wide. The same land that separated human groups could also draw them toward the same shelter, the same animals, the same river bend, or the same passage between mountains. When we look backward, we often want a clean answer. This child was one thing or another, but ancient life may have allowed a body to carry more than one human past, because bodies are made by parents, and parents belong to histories that may have met before we can see them clearly. The child did not need to understand any of this. The child only had to live, breathe, sleep, wake, and be held within a world where survival was never abstract. Hunger would have been felt before it was explained. Cold would have touched skin before it became a climate in a book. Fear would have arrived through sound, darkness, distance, and the movement of animals. Comfort may have been small. A fire, a sheltered wall, a familiar voice, a hand guiding the body through rough ground. These simple things bring the question closer to the origin of humanity, because our beginning was not made only by bones and tools, it was made by dependence. Every human child, ancient or modern, begins unfinished. The body is born needing others. It cannot walk far at once. It cannot gather food alone. It cannot read the land without being shown. In that weakness, human groups became more than collections of individuals. They became lines of care, memory, and movement. If a child came from parents linked to different ancient human groups, then the child also points toward a world where those lines of care could cross. Not always, not everywhere, and not in a simple way, but enough to trouble the picture of separated human worlds. That is the quiet force of this story. It does not begin with a dramatic event. It begins with a small life that makes the past harder to divide. The child stands at the edge of several questions at once. What did it mean to belong in a world where different kinds of humans may have shared landscapes? How often did contact happen in places where food, shelter, and movement overlapped? How much of ancient human history vanished because the people who lived it left no lasting trace? The child cannot answer these questions directly. A child from that time cannot speak across the ages in a full voice. Yet the existence of such a life asks us to stop imagining evolution as if it were only a ladder of replacement. It asks us to place the human body back into the land, back into need, back into the pressure of generations. A single child could make human evolution look wrong because the child brings the drawing down to earth. The lines on the page become parents, groups, valleys, seasons, and crossings. The past becomes less neat, but more human. The deeper problem begins when we try to place that child onto a clean drawing. A tree seems simple. One line rises from the ground, divides into branches, and each branch moves away from the others. It is a peaceful image, and for many questions it is useful. But a tree can also make us forget how life is actually lived. No ancient person walked through the world as a branch. No child was born as a mark on a diagram. Every body came from other bodies. Every small life began inside a chain of parents, grandparents, movements, meetings, losses, and landscapes. If the branches of ancient humanity had truly stayed apart after they separated, then a child should have belonged clearly to one branch only. The story would be easier to tell. One group would stand here, another would stand there. Each would carry its own history forward, separated by time, distance, and form. Yet the child at the center of this question makes that picture uneasy. The body seems to point toward more than one ancient human line at once, and that is where the simple drawing begins to lose its calm. The child does not shout against evolution. The child quietly asks whether our image of evolution has been too straight, too separate, and too clean for the world where human lives actually happened. This matters because the beginning of humanity was never only a matter of one type replacing another. It was also a matter of small groups living close to the limits of food, warmth, and safety. A group could be separated for generations by mountains, ice, forests, or distance, then drawn toward another group by the same shelter, the same animal routes, or the same hard season. The old world was wide, but it was not empty. It held paths that returned. It held caves that could be used again. It held river valleys where different lives might pass through at different times. The child belongs to that kind of world, where separation and contact could both be true. That is what makes the question powerful without needing to make it loud. If human groups were completely sealed from one another, then their histories should remain sealed inside their descendants. But if the land sometimes brought them close, then a body could become a place where older histories met. A child could carry what a drawing keeps apart. For us, looking backward, this is difficult because the mind likes boundaries. We like to say one thing ended and another began. We like to imagine a clear before and after. We like the comfort of a ladder, even when we call it a tree, but the ancient human world may have been more like a cold landscape crossed by many faint tracks. Some tracks vanished under snow, some were crossed by others, some led into places we have not yet found, some left only the smallest trace. The origin of human beings, when seen through this older landscape, becomes less like a single road and more like a long pattern of dispersal, isolation, return, and contact. The child makes this visible because a child is a beginning. Every child is the start of another generation, but also the result of earlier ones. In that small body, the past is not abstract. It is inherited. It is carried without being understood. It is present before memory begins. That is why one child can unsettle a whole picture of evolution, not because one life can explain everything, not because one finding gives permission to invent stories we cannot prove. The power lies in the mismatch between the clean model and the living world. The model wants branches that move apart and stay apart. The child points toward a world where branches could bend close again, where human groups could remain different and still touch, where the boundaries of ancient humanity were real but not always absolute. Before we follow the evidence, it is enough to stay with that quiet unease. A child once lived in a harsh, ancient landscape, and that child now asks us to look again at the shape of our own beginning. The simple picture of human evolution is easy to understand because it gives the past a shape the mind can hold. One kind of human appears, then another comes later. The older form fades, the newer form rises, and the story seems to move forward like footsteps on a single path. In that picture, the human past becomes almost like a quiet procession. First, there are distant ancestors with smaller bodies and simpler tools. Then there are stronger hunters, wider migrations, better stone edges, fire used more often, shelters made with more care, and finally people who look more like us. The line seems to climb. It makes time feel organized. It makes confusion feel manageable. It allows us to say that one stage ended, another began, and the world slowly prepared itself for Homo sapiens. But the older human world was not built for that kind of comfort. It was made of climates that changed, animals that moved, ice that advanced and retreated, rivers that shifted, and small groups that could disappear without leaving more than a few fragments behind. When we place the child from this story inside the simple picture, something begins to feel wrong. If ancient human groups followed a clean line of replacement, then each group should belong mostly to its own time and place. One should step aside before another becomes important. One should be past, another should be future. Yet a child can only exist through real parents, and parents can only meet in a real landscape. The child reminds us that evolution did not happen in a straight hallway. It happened across uneven ground, over thousands of generations, through bodies that had no idea they were carrying history. This simple idea of replacement is not foolish. It grew from a human need to organize evidence. A bone found in one layer may seem older than a bone found in another. A tool type may appear in one period and become more common later. A skull may look different enough that scholars give it a name. Over time, names become categories, and categories become lines on paper. The mind then turns those lines into a story. But the beginning of humanity was not a row of labelled forms waiting neatly in order. It was a living process. Groups could be separated by geography and still remain close enough, at certain edges of time and land, for contact to be possible. Bodies could adapt to different environments and still belong to a wider human family. A lineage could become distinct without becoming sealed forever. That is the difficulty hidden inside the neat drawing. Replacement may describe some patterns, but it cannot hold every crossing, every survival, every meeting, every child. Ancient life was not clean because survival was not clean. Food did not appear in tidy stages. Cold did not divide human groups according to our categories. A drought, a hard winter, a movement of animals, or the search for stone and shelter could pull lives into the same region. Some groups may have avoided one another. Some may have watched from a distance. Some may have met rarely. Some contacts may have lasted only a short time, leaving almost nothing behind. But almost nothing is not the same as nothing. In the deep past, where evidence is thin, even a small trace can force the whole picture to widen. The child at the center of this story is powerful because the child sits exactly where a straight story becomes too narrow. A ladder cannot explain a body that points sideways. A simple line cannot easily hold parents from different ancient human worlds. A clean branch drawing becomes less steady when the branches appear to have touched after they had already grown apart. The question is not whether evolution happened. It did. The question is whether the form we imagine is wide enough for what ancient bodies actually did. To understand why one child made human evolution look wrong, we first have to see how strongly we wanted the past to be simple. One reason the simple picture survives is that it feels natural to the way we learn. A child in a classroom sees a chart, and the chart must fit on a page. A museum wall shows a row of skulls, and the row must have a beginning and an end. A book cannot place every uncertain movement, every lost population, every empty valley, and every vanished child into one image. The shape often looks like progress. Older bodies appear on one side, newer bodies appear on the other. The tools seem sharper. The faces seem closer to ours. The road seems to lead, quietly and almost inevitably, toward us. This is not because the evidence itself is always simple. It is because human minds need handles. Deep time is too large to hold without a frame. Hundreds of thousands of years cannot be felt directly. A life can remember a parent, a grandparent, perhaps a story from before birth, but the beginning of humanity stretches far beyond ordinary memory. So we turn time into pictures. We turn populations into names. We turn long uncertainty into lines. There is a kind of comfort in this. If each ancient human group has a place, then the past feels stable. Neanderthals can be placed in one mental room, Denisovans can be placed in another. Homo sapiens can be placed on the road that reaches the present. The child at the center of this video becomes difficult because the child does not stay quietly inside one room. The child asks what happens when the doors between those rooms were never fully closed. In the ancient world, there were no museum labels separating living bodies. There were only groups moving through weather and land. A ridge might hide another group from sight. A river might guide two groups toward the same crossing. A cave might shelter different people in different generations. A plain might open during one climate and become difficult again in another. The origin of human beings did not unfold as a lesson plan. It unfolded inside changing environments, where survival depended on movement, memory, and contact with the land. The simple picture also survives because it gives us a quiet sense of importance. If evolution is imagined as a ladder, then we stand at the top without having to ask many harder questions. If it is imagined as a clean chain, then our species feels like the final link. Even when we know, intellectually, that evolution has no planned direction, the old habit remains. We speak as if earlier humans were steps toward us, instead of lives adapted to their own worlds. We describe them by what they lacked, not by what their bodies and groups were able to do. A Neanderthal becomes almost modern, but not quite. A Denisovan becomes mysterious because the remains are scarce. Other human populations become shadows because we know them only through fragments or genes. This way of thinking makes the present feel clear, but it makes the past too small. It forgets that every ancient human group was not waiting to become us. Each one was living under its own pressures: cold, hunger, distance, childbirth, injury, animal movement, and the need to stay together long enough for children to grow. When a child carries traces from more than one ancient group, that child does not simply add a detail to the old picture. The child changes the feeling of the picture itself. The past stops looking like a parade of separate forms and begins to look like a landscape of overlapping lives. This is why the neat chart can mislead, even when it is trying to help. It shows separation more easily than meeting. It shows categories more easily than bodies. It shows time more easily than place. But ancient humanity happened in place. It happened in caves, valleys, forests, steppe, riversides, and shelters used again and again under different skies. The simple picture is easy to believe because it is clean. The older world is harder to hold because it was alive. A clean drawing can help us begin, but it can also make us forget the ground. The old human world was not flat paper. It had cold seasons, steep slopes, broken stone, animal paths, rivers that changed course, and long distances that could feel endless to a small group on foot. It had shelters used for a while, abandoned, then perhaps used again by different people under a different sky. It had hunger that could push a group farther than habit allowed. It had danger that could make a familiar place unusable. It had births, deaths, injuries and losses that changed the size of a group without leaving a sign anyone could easily read later. When we imagine evolution as a clean picture, we often remove all of that pressure. We see a branch, a label, a date, and a direction. But ancient people lived inside conditions that shifted around them. Their bodies were not moving because history needed a better diagram. They were moving because water was somewhere else. Animals had gone, firewood was scarce, winter was coming, or a known path still held the memory of survival. That is why the simple picture becomes dangerous when it begins to feel complete. It gives the impression that ancient human groups were like fixed objects placed in separate boxes. In reality, a group could be isolated for a long time and still not be sealed forever. A population could become different across many generations and still share enough of the older human body plan for contact to matter. A landscape could keep groups apart, then bring them close again when climate, hunger, or movement changed the shape of life. The beginning of humanity was full of these slow pressures. It was not only a story of forms appearing one after another. It was also a story of small populations living at the edges of what the land allowed. Some edges were physical: mountains, ice, deserts, forests, rivers. Some were seasonal: cold months, dry months, animal migrations. Some were social: the distance between familiar people and strangers whose bodies were human, but whose habits, voices, and paths may have felt different. A clean diagram does not show those edges well. It prefers separation because separation is easier to draw. It prefers a single direction because a single direction is easier to remember. But the world that produced the child in this story was made of crossings that may have been rare, uneven, and difficult to preserve. The child matters because a living body can reveal what a drawing hides. If two ancient human groups were always separate after their lines divided, then the past should remain divided inside the generations that followed. But if their worlds touched even occasionally, then the history carried in bodies could be less tidy than the history drawn on a page. That does not mean every group mixed freely. It does not mean ancient life was a constant meeting place. It does not give us permission to imagine every detail. It only means the older world had room for contact, and even limited contact could change what a later body remembers. A child born from such a crossing would not look at the world and know that a model of evolution had become unstable. The child would know hunger, warmth, sleep, cold air, adult protection, and the nearness of a group. Yet the body of that child would belong to a deeper record than memory. It would carry earlier movements, older separations, and a meeting that the simple picture did not expect. This is where the question becomes larger than one child. It becomes a question about how we imagine human origin itself. Did we begin as a clean sequence of separate forms, each replacing the one before it? Or did our beginning include separation and contact at the same time, with human groups becoming different while still sometimes reaching one another across hard landscapes? The older world does not answer in a single sentence. It asks for patience. It asks us to see that a neat story can be useful, but too small. A child did not make evolution wrong. A child made the easy version of it feel unfinished. To understand why one child could disturb the usual picture of evolution, the mind has to enter a time when Homo sapiens was not alone on Earth. This is not easy, because the modern world has only one surviving human species. Everywhere we go today, across cities, farms, islands, deserts, and frozen regions, the people we meet all belong to the same living branch. Human difference is real in culture, language, memory, and appearance, but biologically the world now feels singular. There is one humanity. That simple fact quietly trains the imagination. It makes the past feel as if it must have been moving toward this same condition, as if all older forms were merely fading shadows before the arrival of us. But for much of the deeper human story, the Earth may have held several kinds of humans at the same time. They did not live everywhere at once. They were not equal in number, and they were not all known from the same kind of evidence. Some are known from bones, some from tools, some from fragments of DNA, and some from traces so thin that the picture remains incomplete. Yet the broad lesson is clear enough to be careful with. Homo sapiens entered and expanded through a world that already had other human stories inside it. That changes the emotional shape of the past. The land was not an empty stage waiting for modern humans to arrive. It was a living mosaic of bodies, climates, ranges, and older adaptations. In some regions, another human group may have known the caves, the valleys, the animal movements, and the cold seasons long before Homo sapiens reached those edges of the world. In other places, populations may have vanished before contact could leave a clear sign. The beginning of humanity, when seen this way, is not a single lamp moving through darkness. It is more like several small fires burning far apart, sometimes separated by great distance, sometimes weakened by climate, sometimes hidden from one another by mountains or time, and sometimes near enough that one world could touch another. This matters for the child, because a child can only come from a world where living bodies meet. If ancient humanity had truly been a clean chain, with one kind fully gone before another became important, then the idea of more than one human line inside a single life would be much harder to imagine. But a world with overlapping humans makes the question quieter and deeper. It does not make the answer simple. It only gives the question a real landscape to stand on. Think of a cold region where small groups move slowly through the year. One group knows a valley because their elders remember it. Another group arrives later, pushed by hunger, weather, or the movement of animals. They may never meet. They may see only signs. Old ash, broken stone, tracks, a shelter already used. Or their lives may come close enough for fear, avoidance, watching, exchange, violence, care, or kinship to become possible. Science cannot fill every silence in that scene. It should not pretend to, but it can show that ancient human worlds were not always sealed away from one another. The presence of more than one humankind turns evolution from a lonely staircase into a crowded, uneven landscape. The word crowded must be used carefully, because these populations were often small by modern standards. The Earth held vast spaces where no human body stood at all, but compared with the clean picture of one line replacing another, the old world was crowded with possibility. Different human groups could carry different histories in their bodies while still belonging to the larger family of human evolution. Some had adapted to cold. Some moved through warmer lands. Some lived in places where bones rarely survive. Some passed through regions and left little behind. For a child born in such a world, ancestry was not a lesson. It was simply life before memory. But for us, looking back from a world with only one surviving human species, that child becomes a quiet reminder that the human beginning was once wider than the word human now feels. Neanderthals should not be imagined as failed versions of us. That old habit makes the past smaller than it was. They were human relatives shaped by long-time, hard climates and their own ways of living. Their bodies carried strength, endurance, and adaptations that made sense in the regions where many of them lived. A broad chest, powerful limbs, and a body built for cold landscapes were not signs of being less human. They were signs of belonging to a world where warmth, energy, movement, and survival placed heavy demands on the body. They made tools. They used fire. They hunted, gathered, moved through landscapes, and lived in groups where knowledge had to pass from one generation to the next. A Neanderthal child, like any human child, would have needed care, food, shelter, and protection for many years. That long dependence connects them to the deeper origin of humanity, because human life has always begun in weakness before it grows into skill. To call Neanderthals primitive in a careless way is to forget the difficulty of surviving in the worlds they knew. Denisovans are harder to imagine, not because they were less real, but because the physical evidence for them is much thinner. Much of what is known about them comes through ancient DNA, from small remains rather than a full, familiar body laid out before us. That makes them feel almost like a shadow at the edge of the human story. But a shadow is not the same as an invention. Denisovans were an ancient human population, related to Neanderthals and to us through the wider human family, and they appear to have lived across parts of Asia over long stretches of time. Their exact appearance, daily habits, and full range remain uncertain. That uncertainty must be respected. A sleep story about deep history should not fill every silence with decoration. It should let some darkness remain where the evidence remains dark. Still, even with limited traces, Denisovans change the feeling of human evolution because they remind us that not every human past left a face we can easily picture. Some histories survive mostly inside bodies that came later. Some are heard faintly through fragments. Some are known because a small piece of bone, tooth, or genetic signal opened a door that seemed closed. When Neanderthals and Denisovans are placed beside Homo sapiens, the old world becomes wider. It is no longer a simple stage where one actor waits for another to leave. It becomes a landscape of related human groups, each with its own history, its own pressures, and its own place in time. Homo sapiens did not carry intelligence into an empty world of lesser beings. Our ancestors entered regions where other humans had already learned land, cold, hunger, and distance in their own ways. The differences between these groups were real, but difference does not mean absolute separation. A Neanderthal body and a Denisovan body were shaped by long divergence, yet they remained close enough in the deeper biological sense that contact could leave descendants. That is where the child at the center of this video begins to matter more deeply. If the mother belonged to one ancient human group and the father to another, then the child was not a mistake in nature. The child was a sign that the borders between human groups were not as fixed as our categories make them appear. In the living world, a border is often a region, not a wall. A cold valley, a cave mouth, a river crossing, a hunting range, or a seasonal path could bring separate histories into the same space. We do not need to imagine constant mixing. We do not need to turn rare contact into a simple rule. The point is quieter than that. Neanderthals and Denisovans were different enough to be named separately, yet close enough for one child to carry both histories. That single tension makes the ancient world feel less like a set of boxes and more like a breathing landscape, where human difference and human connection existed at the same time. The older human world was not a world with one kind of people standing alone under the sky. It was a world of many human possibilities, spread unevenly across land and time. Some groups were close relatives, some were separated by great distance. Some had bodies shaped by cold, others by different climates and resources. Some left bones that could be studied, others left only faint genetic traces, or no trace at all that we have found. When we say there were many kinds of humans, it does not mean the earth was full in the way it is full now. It means the deep past was wider than the single human world we know today. There were empty regions and silent valleys, yet there were also places where different human histories could overlap. A cave might hold the ash of one group, then later the tools of another. A valley might guide animals through the same narrow passage again and again, drawing people from different directions. A cold shelter might become useful because stone, wind, water, and survival made it useful. In that kind of world, the word human becomes less narrow. It does not point only to us. It points to a larger family of bodies that walked upright, made tools, cared for children, learned landscapes, and carried memory in ways we can only partly recover. The child at the center of this story belongs to that wider human world. If we imagine ancient humanity as only one line, the child becomes confusing too quickly. But if we imagine several related human groups, the confusion changes shape. It becomes a question about contact, distance, and the edges where separate histories could meet. A Neanderthal group did not need to know the word Denisovan. A Denisovan group did not need to understand itself as a branch of evolution. These are modern names, created after the lives were gone, after the bodies had become fragments, after the landscapes had changed. In life, there would have been only familiar people and unfamiliar people, known paths and unknown paths, safe shelters and dangerous open ground. The beginning of humanity was lived through those simple divisions long before it was studied through scientific categories. That is why the past must be approached with care. Names are useful, but they can become too hard in the mind. They can make living groups seem like fixed containers. Each name helps us speak, but each name can also hide the slow movement between places, the uncertainty of borders, and the fact that bodies do not always obey the neatness of words. A child born between two ancient human histories reminds us that a name is not a wall. Difference existed. Separation existed. Long divergence existed. But there may also have been moments when one small group encountered another at the edge of a shared landscape. Such contact may have been rare and shaped by conditions we cannot fully reconstruct. Still, rarity does not make it unimportant. In small populations, even a rare meeting can leave a trace that lasts longer than the people who experienced it. A child is one of the most powerful forms such a trace can take, not because the child explains every crossing, but because the child shows that the old world had room for a crossing at all. That is why this story reaches beyond one cave or one ancient family. It asks us to hold the human past as a living system, not a row of separate figures. Many human groups could exist in the same broad age of the earth without merging into one simple whole. They could remain different and still not be absolutely sealed. They could carry separate adaptations and still share a deeper origin. They could live far apart for long stretches of time and still meet when land, climate, hunger, or movement narrowed the distance. The child makes human evolution look wrong only if the picture is too rigid. Once the old world is seen as small populations, fragile movements, and overlapping landscapes, the child begins to look less like an error and more like a doorway into the hidden width of being human. Denisova Cave should not first be imagined as a famous discovery. Long before it had a name that could travel through books and studies, it was simply a hollow place in stone, set within a landscape of mountains, valleys, cold air, and difficult movement. To the people who entered it, the cave was not evidence. It was shelter. It was shade in one season, protection in another, perhaps a place to pause when weather turned hard or when the body needed rest away from open ground. Its walls did not know Neanderthal, Denisovan, or Homo sapiens. Those names came much later, when people like us tried to arrange the deep past into words. In life, the cave would have belonged to whoever could reach it, use it, remember it, and leave again. That is what makes such a place so important to this story. A cave can hold time differently from open land. Wind can erase a track. Rain can soften a surface. Ice, animals, roots and rivers can disturb what people leave behind. But under certain conditions, a cave may keep small traces for a very long time. Ash, stone tools, broken bone, sediment, and fragments too small to seem important can remain layered in darkness, while the world outside changes again and again. A person might use the cave for a short time and vanish from memory. Another group might arrive long after. Centuries could pass. Thousands of years could pass. The entrance might look out on a land that was colder, warmer, wetter, drier, more open or more wooded than before. Yet the stone hollow could remain, quietly receiving different lives across deep time. For the origin of humanity, this kind of place is more than a backdrop. It is a rare holder of contact between time and body. Most ancient lives disappeared almost completely. Most children left no visible sign. Most footsteps, meals, fears, and nights of sleep returned to the earth without a witness. A cave that preserves even a small part of that lost world becomes a point where the silence is not complete. Denisova Cave is powerful because it sits at such a point. It does not tell the whole human story. No single place can do that. But it opens a narrow window onto a world where different human histories may have passed through the same region, not necessarily together at every moment, not necessarily in ways we can fully see, but close enough that the old categories begin to feel less distant from one another. Imagine the cave without modern knowledge placed over it. There is a mouth of stone, a darker interior, a view toward land that must be read carefully by anyone hoping to survive. The cave offers stillness, but never absolute safety. A group inside would still need food. They would still listen for weather, animals, and strangers. They would still carry children, tools, fuel, and memory. The cave could be a refuge, but also a point along a route. It could be used, left empty, then found again. That repeated possibility matters. If different human groups move through the same broad landscape over long stretches of time, places like this could become quiet intersections. Not intersections like roads in a city, with clear meeting points and obvious signs, but older, slower intersections shaped by terrain. A valley narrows movement. A shelter invites return. A mountain region limits the easiest paths. A cold season presses bodies toward protection. The cave becomes part of the landscape's memory, even when no written memory exists. The child at the center of this video belongs in a deep sense to that kind of memory, not because the cave explains everything, but because it reminds us that ancient human lives were lived in places where time could overlap. One group's shelter could later become another group's shelter. One landscape could hold more than one human story. One small preserved trace could show that the human past was not only scattered across distance, but sometimes gathered, quietly, in the same stone darkness. Around Denisova Cave, the land itself helped shape the question. The cave lies in the Altai region of southern Siberia, where mountains, river valleys, forests, open steppe and long cold seasons could all press close together in one human lifetime. For ancient people, such a landscape was not only scenery, it was a set of limits. A ridge could decide where a group could travel, a river could guide movement or block it, snow could close a path that had been easy in another season, animals could shift their ranges, and people who depended on them might have to shift as well. In a mild season, a valley might feel open enough to cross. In a harder season, the same land could become narrow, dangerous, and demanding. A cave in such a place was more than a hole in rock. It was a point of shelter in a region where shelter mattered. The human body from its earliest beginnings was never separate from this kind of pressure. Our ancestors did not survive by strength alone. They survived by reading land, remembering routes, staying near others, and finding places where the body could endure another night. In the Altai, that endurance would have been tied to cold air, animal movement, stone sources, fire, and the ability of small groups to make decisions before weather made decisions for them. This is why the cave becomes important without needing to be imagined as dramatic. A useful shelter in a difficult landscape can draw life toward it again and again. Not every group would arrive at the same time. Not every visit would leave a visible trace. But over long spans of time, a place like this could become part of a wider pattern of movement. One group might pass through when the climate allowed certain animals to range nearby. Another might use the cave when conditions changed. A third might find the same shelter generations later, with no memory of who had been there before. The stone would not separate them by name. It would only hold what it could. Ash might settle. Tools might break. Bones might remain in fragments. Sediment might cover one layer and wait for another. Outside, the world would keep changing. Inside, small traces could stay. The cave, therefore, becomes a quiet meeting point between human time and geological time. Human lives are short, landscapes are slow. A child grows, is carried, sleeps, hungers, and vanishes from living memory within a few generations. But a cave can preserve a small sign long after the voices are gone. That difference in time is one reason the child's story feels so strange. The life itself was ordinary in the sense that every ancient child belonged to care, weather, need, and the surrounding group. Yet the place where the trace survived was extraordinary because it allowed a tiny part of that life to remain readable far beyond its own generation. When we place this child back into the Altai landscape, the question becomes less like a puzzle on paper and more like a pressure in the land. If Neanderthals, Denisovans, and later Homo sapiens moved through overlapping regions at different times, the cave and its surrounding valleys could have been part of a larger human crossroads. Not a busy crossing in the modern sense, not a place full of constant meetings, but a slow crossroads made by climate and terrain. Cold could push groups toward shelter, hunger could pull them after animals. Memory could return them to known places, distance could keep them apart for long stretches, then the same landscape could reduce that distance when survival routes narrowed. The origin of humanity was shaped by such narrowings. It was shaped by the body's need to stay warm, the group's need to find food, and the child's need to remain close to adults who knew the world. A child born from more than one ancient human history would not be strange to the land that made such contact possible. The strangeness belongs more to our clean categories. The Altai landscape asks us to imagine ancient humans not as fixed labels, but as small moving groups under pressure, sometimes far apart, sometimes close enough for one life to carry a crossing that the cave would keep in silence. If a harsh region could keep human groups far apart, it could also make their paths come close in certain seasons. This is the quiet paradox of a place like the Altai. Mountains can divide, rivers can guide. Cold can scatter people away from exposed ground, but it can also press them toward the few shelters that remain useful when the open land becomes difficult. A cave does not need to be large in the imagination to become important. It only needs to stand in the right place, near roots animals might take, near stone that could be worked, near water, or near a valley where movement was easier than through the higher ground. For ancient humans, survival often followed such practical lines. They were not wandering through an empty map. They were reading a world of limits and openings. A ridge might say no. A river bend might say wait. A cave mouth might say stay for one night or return when the season turns. If different human groups lived across the wider region through deep time, then the same practical needs could bring them into overlapping spaces. Not because they planned a meeting, and not because contact was constant, but because bodies under pressure often follow the same narrow possibilities. Hunger, weather, animals, and shelter can make separate histories lean toward the same ground. That is why the cave matters to the question of the child. If Neanderthals and Denisovans were only imagined as names in separate rooms, the child would seem almost impossible inside that picture. But if they were living populations moving through landscapes that sometimes overlapped, then the question changes. It becomes less about a violation of nature and more about the old world having more contact zones than our diagrams can easily show. A contact zone does not have to be a friendly place. It does not have to be a village, a meeting ground, or a place of easy exchange. It may have been uncertain, tense, brief, or rare. One group might notice another by smoke, footprints, broken stone, or the remains of a fire. They might avoid each other. They might follow the same animals at different times. They might use the same shelter across generations without ever meeting face to face. Or, in some moments we cannot fully reconstruct, lives may have come near enough for kinship to be born. The child at the center of this story makes that final possibility difficult to ignore. The beginning of humanity was shaped by more than biological difference. It was shaped by distance, timing, and the stubborn needs of the body. A human group can become distinct across many generations when separated by land and time. But distinction is not the same as absolute silence. The old landscape could stretch groups away from one another, then later narrow the paths that brought them back into awareness. Climate shifts could open routes and close others. Animal migrations could pull hunters through familiar corridors. Shelters could gather traces from different lives, layer after layer, long after any memory of those lives was gone. In that slow pattern, a single child becomes a sign of something larger. The ancient human world may have had edges that moved. The border between one group and another may have been a living edge, shaped by season, fear, need, and chance, not a hard line drawn across time. that does not mean the groups were the same. It means difference and nearness could exist together. This is the thought that prepares the ground for the deeper evidence. A cave in a cold region can hold more than darkness. It can hold the record of return. It can preserve the fact that human lives, separated by long histories, still entered the same world of stone, weather, hunger, and shelter. If such a place could gather different traces across time, then one child could gather different histories inside one body. And from that point, the simple question becomes harder to avoid. Perhaps human evolution only looked wrong because the old world was never divided as cleanly as we imagined. The story now moves from the cave to the body, because the deepest record was not written on the wall, it was carried inside a small human life. A bone fragment can look almost silent to the eye. It does not show a face. It does not give back a voice. It does not tell us how the child slept, what sounds filled the shelter, whether the child knew fear often, or whether warmth came from fire, from skins, or from the closeness of others. To the modern eye, such a fragment can seem too small to carry a large question. But the human body has always held more history than it can show from the outside. Long before writing, long before memory could travel through names, bodies carried the past through birth. A child was not only a young person in a cold landscape, a child was also the meeting point of earlier generations. Every breath began after countless older breaths. Every hand, every limb, every cell belonged to a chain of life stretching backward through parents, grandparents, and populations that had moved through changing land. In the ancient world, that chain was not understood as DNA. It was simply kinship, resemblance, strength, weakness, and the quiet fact that children came from adults. Yet inside the body, inheritance was keeping a record no one around the child could read. That is why a small remain can become so important without needing to become dramatic. The child may have lived an ordinary ancient life, but the body carried an extraordinary crossing. The outside world could show distance between groups. The inside of the body could show contact. This difference matters. From the outside, Neanderthals and Denisovans can seem like separate names placed far apart in the mind. One name feels attached to certain bones, certain regions, certain cold adaptations. The other feels more hidden, known through fewer physical traces and more through genetic evidence. But inside a child, names are not separate rooms. Inheritance does not care about our tidy labels. It carries what came from the mother, what came from the father, and what older ancestors had already passed down. A child's body is therefore a kind of quiet archive, not because it chooses to remember, but because life continues by copying itself with variation, generation after generation. This reaches back to the beginning of humanity in a direct way. Human origins were never only about tools, fires, migrations, or bones in layers of earth. They were also about reproduction, childhood, survival through dependence, and the repeated chance that one generation would live long enough to make the next. A population can look like an idea when written in a book, but in the world itself, a population is made of births, deaths, pairings, losses, and children who may or may not survive. The child at the center of this story brings that truth back into view. If the child carried ancestry from more than one ancient human group, then the question is not only where those groups lived, the question is how their lives came close enough for a child to exist. That kind of evidence is different from a tool left on a floor or ash from an old fire. A tool may show behavior, a hearth may show presence, a layer of sediment may show time, but the body can show relationship. It can show that two histories did not merely occupy the same broad age of the earth, but touch through living people. Still, the body does not tell everything. It does not explain the feelings of the parents. It does not describe the social world around them. It does not tell whether the meeting was common or rare, peaceful or tense, expected or accidental. Those silences must remain silences. What remains powerful is quieter. A small trace from one child turned the question of evolution inward, away from the clean shape of branches and toward the hidden record inside the human body. The land made meetings possible. The cave preserved a sign, but the body carried the crossing. Inside every human body there is a history that does not speak in words. It is not memory as a child would feel memory. It is not a story told by elders beside fire. It is older and quieter than that. It is inheritance, passed from parents to children before any child can understand where life comes from. In the ancient world, no one looking at a newborn could see the long record carried within. They could see resemblance, perhaps the shape of a face, the strength of a limb, the colour of hair or skin, the way a child grew more like one adult than another. But they could not see the deep pattern beneath those signs. They could not see how older populations had moved, separated, endured cold, crossed valleys, and sometimes come close again. Today, ancient DNA gives us a way to read part of that hidden record, but it must be understood gently. It does not bring back the whole person. It does not tell us what the child thought, what the parents felt, or what the group believed. It only gives certain clues about biological relationship, ancestry, and the long paths that led to one body. That is already enough to change the question. A stone tool can show that hands work stone. A hearth can show that fire was used. A cave layer can show that someone was there in a certain stretch of time. But DNA can show that one life was connected to other lives in a way the eye cannot see. This is why the child matters so deeply. The child's body becomes a small meeting place between personal life and deep history. Every human child begins as a new life, but never as a life without a past. The body is built from material inherited from parents, and those parents carry the traces of their own parents before them. Behind that are many generations, most of them unnamed, most of them gone without a mark in stone or bone. The beginning of humanity was carried forward through this ordinary chain: birth, care, survival, reproduction, and the fragile hope that children would live long enough to become adults. In a cold, ancient landscape, this chain was never guaranteed. Hunger could break it, injury could break it, a hard season could break it, distance from others could make a small group weaker. Yet when the chain continued, it carried more than life alone. It carried the record of where bodies had come from. It carried past separations and past contacts. It carried changes shaped by environment, chance, and time. For the child in this story, that hidden record is what makes the clean picture of evolution feel too simple. If we only looked at the outside of ancient lives, we might imagine groups as separate shapes moving through separate regions. We might place them on a chart and feel that the order was clear. But inheritance can preserve crossings that no tool shape can explain by itself. A body can hold evidence of contact even when the landscape has erased the path, even when no shelter keeps the full scene, even when no story survives. Still, DNA should not be treated like a magic voice from the past. It is a trace, and traces need caution. Ancient DNA can be damaged, incomplete, and difficult to interpret. It must be compared carefully. It must be read alongside bones, sediments, dates, tools, and the geography of where people lived and moved. The child does not give permission to fill the darkness with fantasy. The child gives permission to ask a better question. What if the history of human evolution was not only written in differences between groups, but also in the rare places where those differences met? What if a young body could carry a crossing that no landscape map would show clearly? That thought returns us to the oldest human beginning, where every generation depended on the one before it, and where the future of a group could rest in the bodies of children. In that sense, DNA is not a cold abstraction. It is the thread between flesh, family, landscape, and time. The hidden record inside the child does not mean nature made a mistake. It means the picture in our minds may have been drawn with lines that were too hard. A child born from two ancient human histories would not have felt like a contradiction while living. The body would simply have needed food, warmth, sleep, touch, and protection. The lungs would have taken in cold air. The stomach would have known hunger. The skin would have felt the difference between shelter and open ground. Around that young life, adults would have carried the knowledge of paths, animals, stone, fire, and danger. Nothing in that world required the child to fit a modern category. The problem appears later, when we try to place the child into a diagram that expects ancient groups to remain separate after their lines have split. That diagram can be useful, but it is not the world itself. It is a tool made by people trying to understand deep time with limited evidence. The child reminds us that a tool for thinking can become misleading when it is mistaken for the full shape of life. If Neanderthals and Denisovans were different enough to have distinct histories, but close enough for a child to inherit from both, then evolution was not a simple set of locked rooms. It was a process in which separation could happen, difference could grow, and yet contact could still leave a mark. This is not a denial of difference. It is a more careful way to understand it. Different human groups could have their own adaptations, their own ranges, their own long histories, and still exist within a wider biological relationship that had not been completely broken. That is why the child changes the feeling of the question. The child does not erase the branches. The child shows that branches may not have behaved like clean wooden lines on a page. In real landscapes, populations are made of bodies, and bodies move. They move because seasons change, because animals migrate, because known places become dangerous, because children must be kept alive, because hunger pushes decisions before the mind has time to make a beautiful plan. The beginning of humanity was carried through these pressures. It was not carried by a chart. It was carried by people walking, waiting, returning, avoiding, meeting, and surviving long enough for another generation to begin. When the body of one child holds more than one ancient ancestry, it brings all of that movement back into the picture. It asks us to think of evolution less as a staircase and more as a landscape where streams can divide and later meet again. A stream that joins another does not stop having its own source. It only becomes part of a wider flow. Human evolution may have held moments like that, long separations followed by limited contact, distinct populations connected by rare crossings, old lines that did not simply vanish when they touched. The child is powerful because the evidence is personal without becoming fully knowable. We can speak carefully about ancestry, but not about the child's voice. We can speak about biological relationship, but not about the child's name. We can say the body carries a crossing, but not pretend to know the meaning that crossing had for the people nearby. This caution matters because deep history is easily damaged by overconfidence. The more distant the world, the easier it is to turn a small trace into a full story that was never proven. The child asks for the opposite. The child asks for patience. A small body from a harsh ancient world shows that the line between human groups could be firm enough to make difference, yet open enough for inheritance to pass across it. That is why the child made human evolution look wrong, not because evolution failed, and not because the child was unnatural, but because the older human world was more woven than the simple picture allowed. The child's hidden record becomes more precise when we come to the fact that gives this story its strange weight. The child was not only connected in a distant way to different ancient human groups. The evidence indicates something much closer. A mother from the Neanderthal line, and a father from the Denisovan line. That detail should be spoken slowly, because it can easily sound larger than it should, or simpler than it really is. It does not mean every boundary in the ancient human world disappeared. It does not mean Neanderthals and Denisovans were the same. It does not mean such children were common everywhere. What it means is quieter, and perhaps more important. At least in this one life, two ancient human histories that had been separated across long time came close enough to make a child. The body of that child carried the nearness of two worlds that our modern diagrams often place apart. Before any name was given to the discovery, before any modern person tried to explain it, the child existed within the ordinary pressures of an ancient landscape. A mother had a body shaped by one long history. A father had a body shaped by another. Both belonged to the wider human family, but their populations had travelled through different paths of time. Their ancestors had lived, moved, endured, and changed under different pressures. Yet somewhere in the old world, those histories were not too far apart to meet. This is where the question becomes deeper than ancestry alone. A mother and father are not abstract lines. They are living people inside a place, with bodies that need warmth, food, rest, and the protection of others. For a child to exist, there had to be a crossing not only of genes, but of lives. We do not know the full human meaning of that crossing. We do not know whether it came from a brief contact, a longer closeness between groups, a movement through the same region, or a more complex social situation that left almost no trace. We should not invent what the evidence does not give. But the fact of the child still matters. It tells us that ancient human groups were not only ideas separated by labels, they were populations that could, under some conditions, come into contact through real bodies. The beginning of humanity has always depended on this simple, fragile reality. No generation continues without children, and no child begins without a joining of earlier lives. In the modern world, that thought feels ordinary. In the deep past, it becomes a way of reading movement, contact, and survival. If a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father had a child, then the landscape around them had allowed two histories to become close enough for one new life to begin. That does not answer every question. It opens more. Where did the groups meet? Were their ranges overlapping often, or only at certain edges? Did the parents belong to groups that recognized each other as familiar, strange, threatening, useful, or simply human in some older sense beyond our words? These questions remain partly in darkness. Still, the child gives us a fixed point in that darkness. Not a full scene, not a complete memory, a point. From that point, the clean tree of evolution begins to look less like a final truth and more like a helpful sketch with missing crossings. The mother's line and the father's lines had histories of their own, but in the child, they were no longer only separate. They became one living body, one fragile beginning, one trace preserved by chance and time. This is why the discovery feels so different from simply saying that different human groups once existed. Many groups can exist without meeting. Many branches can divide without touching again. But a child born from two of them shows that division was not the whole story. The old human world held difference, but it also held moments when difference could become kinship. And once that is understood, the question of evolution becomes less about which branch replaced which, and more about how many hidden crossings were lost before one child allowed us to see even one of them. It is easy to hear the words mother and father and feel that the question has become simple. One parent belonged to one ancient human group. The other parent belonged to another. A child was born. But if we stop there, the old world becomes too small again. A child does not appear only from biology. A child appears inside a setting of movement, contact, risk, and social life. For a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father to become part of the same child's beginning, their worlds had to come near each other in some way. That nearness is the harder question. It asks us to look beyond the fact of ancestry and imagine the conditions that made contact possible without pretending to know details that have not survived. Perhaps the meeting happened near a shelter used by more than one group over time. Perhaps it happened along a route where animals, water and stone drew different people into the same valley. Perhaps climate narrowed the usable land, pushing small groups toward the same places when food became harder to find. Perhaps one group had been moving through the region for generations, while another arrived during a period when routes opened across the landscape. These are possibilities, not answers. Their value is not that they solve the story, but that they make the child belong to a real world again. The beginning of humanity was never only a matter of separate populations standing still. It was also a matter of how land allowed bodies to move. A group that seems distant in a diagram may become less distant when a river guides travel through a narrow corridor. A population that looks separate across deep time may still touch another at the edge of its range. A cold season can make the open world feel smaller. A cave can gather lives without announcing that it has done so. For people living then, contact between groups may not have looked like a grand historical event. It may have been tense, cautious, brief, ordinary, or impossible to classify in words we would recognize. One group might have seen another from a distance before any direct meeting occurred. They might have noticed smoke, broken tools, footprints, bones left from a meal, or the smell of a fire carried through still air. They might have avoided one another for a time. They might have competed over the same resources. They might have shared a landscape without sharing trust. Or, in rare moments, the distance between unfamiliar bodies may have narrowed enough for a relationship to become possible. The child does not tell us which of these happened. That silence is important. It keeps the story honest. What the child does tell us is that the boundary between these two ancient human histories was not absolute in every place and every moment. A biological crossing had to rest on some kind of lived crossing, even if the shape of that crossing is lost. That thought brings the question back to the human body. Every ancient population was made of individuals who needed to sleep, eat, heal, avoid danger, and care for children. These needs were not separate from evolution. They were the daily surface of it. Differences between human groups grew over long stretches of separation, but contact would have happened through ordinary pressures: hunger, shelter, movement, fear, curiosity, injury, dependence, and perhaps the slow recognition that another body, though unfamiliar, was still close enough to become part of life. The child makes us pause because the child carries the result, while the cause remains mostly hidden. We can see the crossing in the body more clearly than we can see the meeting in the world. That imbalance is what makes deep history feel so quiet and difficult. The evidence points to a mother, a father, and a child, but the valley around them remains dim. The voices are gone. The gestures are gone. The social meaning is gone. Only the trace remains, and that trace asks us not to reduce the story to a simple word. It was not just mixing. It was not just a label. It was a moment when two long human histories, shaped by different paths through time, became close enough for one new life to begin. The meeting behind the child does not have to be imagined as a clear scene. It may never become clear. The deeper past often gives us results without giving us the whole path that led there. We can see that two ancient human histories came together in one body, but the world around that event remains mostly covered. Still, the child allows us to think carefully about the kinds of places where such closeness could happen. Ancient human groups did not move randomly. They followed the pressure of life. They moved where animals could be found, where water could be reached, where stone could be shaped, where fuel might last, and where shelter could protect the body from weather. These needs were shared by different human groups because all of them were living bodies under the same sky. A Neanderthal group and a Denisovan group may have carried different histories, but cold would still press on both. Hunger would still pull both toward food. A useful valley would still be useful. A cave that broke the wind would still matter. A river crossing would still narrow movement into one place. This is why the landscape itself may have created the first condition for contact. It did not erase difference, but it could bring difference into the same field of survival. Imagine a valley during a hard season. The higher ground is difficult. Animals move along lower routes. Water remains near a channel that has not frozen completely, or a sheltered slope holds less snow than the surrounding land. A group already familiar with the area may return because memory tells them where to go. Another group, pushed by the same conditions, may enter the edge of that world. They may not share language in a way we could understand. They may not share customs, sounds, or habits. They may watch, avoid, threaten, or tolerate one another. They may meet only briefly. But even brief contact is not nothing. In deep time, where groups were small and distances large, a rare meeting could leave a sign more lasting than the meeting itself. The child becomes that kind of sign. Not a full story, not a complete scene, but a living consequence of two paths crossing. This brings the question back to the beginning of humanity, because human origin was never only about the spread of a species across land. It was also about how small groups handled the presence of others. The earliest human worlds were built around kin, who belonged near the fire, who shared food, who carried a child, who could be trusted in darkness, who knew the way back to a shelter. Outside that circle, another group may have been dangerous, strange, useful, or simply uncertain. The line between stranger and kin is one of the oldest social questions in the human story. The child suggests that, at least once in the world we can trace, that line was crossed deeply enough to create family. Yet caution must stay with us. We cannot know whether this crossing came from peace, tension, adoption into a group, repeated contact, or a single encounter. We cannot know whether the child was accepted in a simple way, marked as different, or seen through categories that have vanished with the people who held them. It would be dishonest to place modern feelings too strongly onto that world, but we can say that the child points toward a contact zone where biology, landscape, and social life touched. That is more powerful than a dramatic story, because it is grounded in the pressures that made ancient life possible. Shelters, routes, animal ranges, and hard climates did not merely surround human evolution. They shaped the chances for human groups to remain apart or come close. The child's parents were not symbols, they were bodies moving inside those chances. Their meeting, whatever its human meaning, turned a long separation into one new life. In that life, the distance between Neanderthal and Denisovan was no longer only a matter of time, bone, or name. It became breath, hunger, sleep, growth, and dependence. It became a child who forces us to ask whether the old human world was defined not by walls, but by edges where lives could sometimes meet. A tree is one of the easiest ways to imagine descent. It begins with a trunk, then divides into branches, and each branch carries the memory of an older connection. For human evolution, this image has been useful because it gives shape to a past that is too large to see directly. A common origin becomes the lower trunk. Later populations become branches. A point where one line separates from another becomes a split. Time moves upward. Difference grows outward. With one drawing, the mind can hold millions of years that no single life could ever feel. The image is calm, and there is truth in it. Humans do share older roots with other forms of life. Ancient human groups did diverge from one another. Populations were shaped by separation, geography, climate, and generations of change. A branch can show that two groups once shared a deeper ancestry before their histories moved apart. It can show that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens were not strangers in the absolute sense, but related human populations within a larger story. The difficulty begins when the image becomes too clean. On paper, once a branch divides, it usually stays apart. One line goes one way, another line goes another way. The space between them grows wider, and the drawing makes that separation feel permanent. But living populations do not move like ink. They move through valleys, forests, rivers, cold seasons, dry seasons, and the hard search for food. A point of separation in deep time does not mean every later generation lived behind an invisible wall. It means groups became different through time, often because distance and environment kept them apart long enough for their bodies and histories to change. Yet distance is not always the same distance forever. A landscape can widen separation in one age and narrow it in another. Ice can close a route, then retreat. Grassland can spread, then shrink. Forest can thicken, then open. Animals can shift their paths, and people who follow them can shift as well. The beginning of humanity was shaped inside that moving world, not inside a still drawing. This is why the tree matters, and why it can mislead. It helps us see shared origin, but it does not easily show return, contact, or crossing. It shows the split more clearly than the later meeting. It shows difference more easily than relationship after difference. When a child carries ancestry from two ancient human groups, the tree image does not become useless, but it becomes incomplete. The child forces the eye to look not only at where branches divided, but at whether some branches remained close enough, in the living world, for contact to pass between them. A root tells us that histories began together. A split tells us that histories moved apart. But a child like this asks whether the lines also bent back toward one another somewhere in the dark space between the branches. That is not a small question. It changes how the whole shape of human evolution feels. If the tree is read too rigidly, then each branch becomes almost like a separate destiny. Neanderthals remain on one side, Denisovans remain on another. Homo sapiens stands somewhere else, moving toward the present. The drawing begins to feel orderly, but the order may come from the drawing more than from life. In the old world, groups were made of bodies, not labels. A population survived only if children were born, cared for, fed, and carried through danger into adulthood. Those children inherited more than a group name. They inherited the biological record of who had met whom before they were born. A split on a tree can show that two populations had become distinct. It cannot by itself tell us whether every later boundary remained closed. The child at the center of this story lives inside that missing space. The child does not remove the roots. The child does not erase the branches. The child simply makes the branches feel less like hard lines and more like histories moving through land. Evolution still has ancestry, separation, and change. But in human evolution, there may also have been moments when separated histories touched again, not as ideas, but as parents, children, and bodies carrying the past forward. When a branch splits on a tree, the drawing makes the separation look final. This is useful for teaching, but it can quietly create the wrong feeling. A branch on paper has no hunger. It has no winter. It does not follow animals. It does not search for stone, water, firewood, or shelter. It does not lose people. It does not carry children through a dangerous valley. It cannot be forced by climate into the same narrow passage as another branch. Living populations are different. They are made of bodies under pressure, and bodies move in ways that drawings cannot fully predict. If two ancient human groups separated long ago, that separation could shape them deeply. Their bodies could change. Their ranges could shift. Their ways of living could become different. Their histories could grow apart for many thousands of years. But if they still remained close enough in the wider human family, then a later meeting was not impossible simply because the drawing had shown a split. This is where the child makes the tree harder to trust as a complete picture. The child does not deny that Neanderthals and Denisovans had different histories. The child makes us ask what happened after those histories became different. Did they always stay apart in every valley, every generation, every climate shift, every edge of their range? Or did the world sometimes bring them close enough for ancestry to cross from one line into another? A tree shows where lines diverge, but it struggles to show what geneticists call gene flow, the passing of ancestry between populations after they have become distinct. The phrase may sound technical, but the reality behind it is simple and deeply human. It means that at some time, somewhere, living people from different populations had children, and those children carried both histories forward. In the deep beginning of humanity, this was not an abstract process. It was a child being born, a group needing to feed another mouth, a young body depending on adults through cold and hunger. A branch on a page may look separate forever, but a child can join what the page has kept apart. This does not mean ancient human groups were constantly merging. That would be another simple story. And the past does not need one simple story replaced by another. Separation was real, distance was real, difference was real. Some groups may have lived far apart for long stretches of time. Some may have disappeared without leaving any known descendants. Some may have met and left no lasting trace we can recognize. But the child shows that at least some boundaries were not absolute. A split in ancestry did not always become a wall. It could become a long distance, a difference in body and history, and still, under certain conditions, a line that could be crossed. This is why the old tree begins to look more like a sketch than a final map. It gives us the main divisions, but not every hidden connection. It shows the large shape, but not the smaller paths running between its branches. Human evolution may need both images at once, the tree for shared origin and divergence, and a network for later contact. A network does not erase the tree. It adds the crossings the tree cannot easily hold. In a network, one line can move away and still receive something from another line later. One population can remain distinct and still carry traces of contact. One child can stand where two histories meet, even if those histories had been separate for a very long time. For the origin of humanity, this changes the emotional meaning of the past. We are not looking at isolated forms lined up like objects. We are looking at small populations moving through a changing planet, sometimes far apart, sometimes near enough for life to pass between them. The child made human evolution look wrong because the drawing had been too still, while the ancient world was moving. A better image for this older human world may be a river system. High in the mountains, small streams begin separately, each shaped by its own slope, stones, rain, snow, and distance. Some streams run far from one another and never meet again. Some disappear underground. Some become larger, colder, faster, or slower depending on the land that holds them. But other streams join, separate into channels, join again, and carry traces of more than one source in the same water. This does not make the streams meaningless. It does not erase where they began. It only shows that movement can create connection after separation. Human evolution may need that kind of image beside the tree. The tree helps us see origin and divergence. The river helps us feel contact, return, and mixture across a changing landscape. For the child at the center of this story, the river image is closer to the body than the straight line. A mother's history and a father's history did not remain as two labels floating in the air. They entered one life, as inheritance, as flesh, as a small body needing care in a hard world. The child was not a theory of evolution. The child was a place where two older currents met. Another image may be a network of faint paths across cold ground. One path begins near a shelter, another near a valley, another near a river crossing. For long stretches, the paths may seem separate. Snow covers some, grass grows over others. Animals change their routes. Groups move away, return, or vanish. Yet in some places, the paths cross because the land gives only a few good choices. A pass through mountains, a cave protected from wind, a water source in a dry season, or a valley rich with animals can pull different lives toward the same narrow ground. The beginning of humanity was made in such choices. Our ancestors and our ancient relatives were not abstract populations arranged neatly in time. They were bodies following the possible. They moved where feet could go, where children could be carried, where fire could be kept, where the next meal might be found. In that world, separation was real, but so were crossings. A network of paths can show what a tree often hides, the way small groups could become different, while still sometimes touching at the edges of survival. This image must remain quiet and careful. It would be wrong to imagine every ancient group flowing easily into every other group. Deep history does not support that simple comfort. Some lines truly ended. Some populations may have remained distant for enormous lengths of time. Some meetings left no known descendants. Some traces are still missing, and perhaps always will be. But the existence of one child with two ancient human histories makes it difficult to hold only the cleanest picture. A tree with branches moving away from one another can still be true in one sense, but it needs the river, the path, and the network beside it. It needs a way to show that life can divide without becoming silent forever. It needs room for rare meetings, small populations, for contact at the margins, for bodies that preserve what landscapes erase. This changes the feeling of human origin. It suggests that the story was not only about one branch becoming stronger while others faded, it was also about a world in which different human histories live near enough, at least sometimes, for inheritance to cross. The child makes evolution look wrong because the common picture expected clean distance. The older world gave us something slower and more difficult: distance with openings, difference with contact, separation with hidden return. Perhaps the human story was never best imagined as a ladder, and never fully held by a tree alone. Perhaps it was a landscape of many paths, some ending in silence, some crossing briefly, and some leaving traces inside children who could never know what they carried. Cold did not only test ancient human bodies, it also changed the distances between them. A warm period could open a landscape that had once been difficult. A colder period could close familiar routes and push animals, plants, and people into different patterns. Forests could spread, then retreat. Grasslands could widen, then break apart. Ice could make some places impossible while making other passages more useful. To people living then, climate was not a background idea. It was the shape of the day, the weight of the season, the reason a group stayed, left, returned, or vanished. A small group did not need to understand global climate to feel its pressure. They felt it in the body, in hunger, cold hands, long walks, scarce fuel, empty animal trails, and the need to find shelter before darkness. This matters because the child at the center of this story did not come from a world of fixed borders. The land itself kept changing the borders. A place that separated one human group from another for generations could later become a route. A valley that once offered enough food might become poor. A higher region that once blocked movement might become passable in a different climate. The old human world was therefore not still. It breathed slowly with temperature, rainfall, vegetation, and animal movement. In that slow breathing, different human groups could be pulled apart, then brought closer again. The beginning of humanity was shaped by this unstable geography. Our ancient relatives did not move through clean territories marked by lines. They moved through living zones of risk and possibility. If animals gathered along a river, people might follow. If open steppes spread across a region, movement could become easier. If forest thickened, visibility and travel might change. If cold deepened, shelters became more valuable. If a cave broke the wind and stood near useful resources, it could become a point of return across many generations. These environmental pressures help explain why separation and contact could exist together. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens did not need to live side by side everywhere for their histories to touch. They only needed certain places, at certain times, where the same needs narrowed the distance between groups. Food is one of the strongest forces in that narrowing. Large animals do not move randomly forever. They follow water, vegetation, season, and terrain. People who depend partly on those animals must learn their patterns or suffer. A herd moving through a valley can draw human attention from more than one direction. A river crossing can become important not because people choose it as a symbol, but because animals and bodies both find it useful. Stone matters too. Not all stone breaks well for tools. A source of workable material could draw people back to the same region again and again. Water matters, even in cold places. Shelter matters when wind and temperature threaten sleep and recovery. Each of these needs can make a landscape smaller. Vast land may surround a group, but only a few places may be good enough at the right season. In a world of small populations, that is enough to change the meaning of distance. Two groups could be far apart in ordinary time, then close in a season of pressure. They could remain different in history, body, and habit, yet still enter the same ecological doorway. The child makes sense only when we remember those doorways. A meeting between ancient human groups was not created by curiosity alone. It may have been created by hunger, weather, animal movement, shelter, and the practical memory of where survival had once been possible. This does not make the past simple. It makes it more careful. The environment did not force one single outcome. It did not guarantee contact. It did not make every boundary disappear, but it shaped the chances. It made some crossings unlikely, some possible, and a few perhaps unavoidable. When one child carried more than one ancient human history, that body may have preserved a result of these deep environmental pressures. The land moved slowly, the climate shifted, the animals followed their own needs, and human groups followed the narrow openings left to them. Somewhere within that moving world, distance became nearness, and nearness became part of a child. When food moved, people moved. This simple truth may be one of the quiet engines behind the child's story. Ancient human groups could not stay in one place simply because a place was familiar. Familiar ground could become empty. A riverbank that gave food in one season might give little in another. A valley rich with animals for many years could grow poor when climate shifted, vegetation changed, or herds followed better grazing somewhere else. To survive, people had to read these changes with their bodies. They watched tracks, droppings, broken branches, water levels, wind, snow, and the behavior of animals. They remembered where roots might be found, where stone could be worked, where wood was dry enough to burn, where shelter could hold warmth through the night. Movement was not adventure. It was the slow cost of staying alive. In the deep beginning of humanity, feet were one of the first tools of survival. Long before large settlements, long before fields, long before maps, human lives were tied to paths remembered across seasons. A group might return to a valley because elders had gone there before. Another group, with a different history, might reach the same valley because the animals had led them there, or because cold had made another route harder. The land did not ask which human group had a right to arrive. It only offered limits and openings. That is how separate histories could enter the same space without the world announcing that a boundary had been crossed. Water could do this. A reliable stream in a harsh season could draw many kinds of life toward it. Animals came to drink. People came because animals came, and because their own bodies needed water as well. Stone could do this too. A place with good raw material for tools might become important across many generations, not because anyone owned it in a modern sense, but because sharp edges mattered for cutting, scraping, breaking, and surviving. Shelter could do this most quietly of all. A cave, a rock overhang, a protected slope, or a place out of the worst wind could become useful again and again. Different groups might use it at different times, with no shared memory between them, but the landscape would have created a pattern of return. For Neanderthals, Denisovans, and later Homo sapiens, such patterns mattered because all were living through bodies that needed the same basic things, even if their histories were different. Their tools may not have been identical, their ranges may not have been the same, their bodies may have carried different adaptations, yet hunger and cold are older than names. They can pull unlike groups towards similar choices. A narrow pass, a sheltered valley, or a river corridor can make a vast world feel suddenly close. The origin of humanity was shaped by this repeated narrowing of space. Small populations could live far apart for long stretches, then find themselves near the same resources when conditions changed. This nearness did not guarantee trust. It did not guarantee peaceful contact. It did not even guarantee direct contact at all. One group might arrive after another had left, reading only the remains of a fire or the scatter of broken stone, but sometimes, perhaps rarely, timing may have overlapped. Two groups might have seen each other across open ground. They might have avoided each other at first. They might have competed, watched, copied, feared, or tolerated. Deep history does not preserve these moments clearly. It gives us traces, not full scenes. Still, the child tells us that at least one kind of closeness became more than passing through the same landscape. It became ancestry. That is why movement after food, water, and shelter is not a side detail. It is part of the mechanism that made the child possible. If ancient human groups had remained fixed, separate, and sealed, the clean picture might have survived more easily. But the body cannot remain fixed when the land changes. A child born from two ancient human histories asks us to imagine not a single dramatic meeting, but a long world of practical movement, where hunger shortened distance, shelter gathered traces, and survival opened paths between lives that our diagrams had placed apart. The child becomes clearest when the land is allowed to enter the body. Climate did not only decide which groups could survive in a region, it shaped which lives could approach one another, which paths stayed open, which shelters remained worth returning to, and which distances became smaller than they looked on a map. In the older human world, the environment was not a background behind evolution. It was one of the quiet forces arranging the chances of meeting. A cold season could push people toward protection. A herd could pull different groups along the same valley. A dry period could make water more important than fear. A useful cave could gather traces from people who did not arrive together and may not have carried the same history in their bodies. This is why the child is more than a sign of ancestry. The child may also be a sign of landscape. Somewhere before that young life began, two long human histories had to become close in the practical world of food, shelter, movement, and risk. The mother's history and the father's history did not meet in an abstract space. They met because bodies were living under conditions that allowed, or forced, nearness. That is a slower way to think about evolution. It reminds us that natural selection is not only a distant idea about stronger bodies and weaker bodies, it is also the daily pressure of where a body can go, what it can eat, whether it can stay warm, and whether a child can be kept alive through another season. From the beginning of humanity, survival has depended on the connection between body and place. Hands became useful because there were things to carry and shape. Feet mattered because food, water, and shelter were never all in one place. Memory mattered because a group had to know when to leave and where to return. Care mattered because children were born helpless into landscapes that did not slow down for them. The child at the center of this story carries all of that quietly. If the child had ancestry from two ancient human groups, then the body preserves not only a biological crossing, but also the result of movements that the land made possible. The environment did not write the child's history alone. It did not decide one certain outcome, but it shaped the field in which outcomes could happen. It opened some routes and closed others. It made some shelters valuable. It made some regions empty and others briefly crowded with need. It turned distance into something unstable. Two groups might be far from one another across many generations, then suddenly nearer because the good choices had narrowed. This is one reason the simple drawing of evolution feels too still. A drawn branch stays where it is placed. A living population does not. It can shrink, expand, split, return, vanish, or meet another population at the edge of a changing world, the child makes that movement visible in the most human way possible, through a young body that began where two histories had crossed. Even then, the crossing should not be made too easy in the imagination. It may have been rare. It may have happened at the edge of ranges rather than in the center of daily life. It may have involved groups already under stress. It may have left almost no sign beyond the child. The point is not to turn one life into a complete explanation. The point is to notice what one life allows us to ask. If climate, animal movement, water, stone, and shelter could bring different human groups into overlapping spaces, then evolution was not only the story of bodies adapting to places, it was also the story of places shaping which bodies could meet. That is why the child makes the old picture feel unfinished. The child stands at the crossing of environment and inheritance, of weather and ancestry, of survival and time. In that small life, the land did not simply surround human evolution. The land helped arrange one of the hidden meetings that made human evolution harder to draw in a straight line. A child belongs to one moment, but that moment is made from many generations. This is easy to forget when we speak about ancient populations. We may say Neanderthal, Denisovan, or Homo sapiens, and the names begin to feel large, almost like solid blocks moving through time, but no population has ever lived as a block. A population is made of bodies, and bodies pass through childhood, hunger, injury, care, age, and death. A population continues only when enough children live long enough to become adults, and when enough adults remain close enough to protect, teach, and reproduce. In the ancient world, this was never guaranteed. Groups were small, distances were wide. A hard winter, a dangerous injury, a failed hunt, or a long season of hunger could change the future of a group more deeply than any drawing can show. The child at the center of this story should be seen inside that fragile structure. The child was not only an individual life, and not only a genetic clue. The child was part of a generation, and every generation is a narrow bridge between what has already happened and what can still continue. In a small ancient group, one birth mattered, one death mattered, one meeting with another group could matter. This does not mean every event changed the whole course of evolution. It means the old human world was sensitive to small numbers in a way the modern world is not. Today, millions of people can live within one region. In the deeper past, a human landscape might hold only scattered groups, separated by ridges, forests, rivers, and long walking distances. When numbers are small, chance becomes stronger. A group can disappear without being replaced. A child can carry ancestry that may become common, rare, or vanish completely. A contact between two populations can leave a trace that lasts, or it can end silently with one life. This is why one child can make a question feel larger than the size of the evidence. The child does not represent every ancient meeting. The child does not prove that such crossings were common, but the child shows that a crossing could enter the next generation. That is a different kind of fact from saying two groups lived in the same broad world. It means contact moved from landscape into lineage. It means a meeting did not end with the people who experienced it. It became part of a young body, and potentially part of what could be passed forward. The beginning of humanity was shaped by such fragile passages. Evolution is often described over enormous stretches of time, but it happens through generations that are always small when lived from inside. Parents have children. Children survive or do not. Groups split, shrink, merge, or fade. A rare ancestry can disappear if no descendants continue, or it can remain hidden for long periods, carried quietly through bodies that never know its origin. The child makes us feel this scale more clearly. Deep time is vast, but it is built from moments as small as a birth. A population history can be altered not by a grand event, but by repeated small crossings, each one ordinary to the people living through it and almost invisible afterward. This is why the child's existence is so unsettling to a simple model. A model likes large categories. It prefers one group replacing another, one branch ending, one branch continuing. A generation does not behave so neatly. It is full of uncertainty. Some children carry mostly the ancestry expected within their group. Some may carry traces from contact at the edge of a population's range. Some may not survive long enough to pass anything forward. Some may become the beginning of a line that later people can still detect. We must be careful not to claim more than the evidence gives. One child is not a whole population. One body is not a full map of ancient life. But one child can reveal that the old map had room for something the simple picture left out. In that sense, the child stands as a quiet reminder that human evolution did not move only through species names and long timelines. It moved through generations, and generations are made of fragile children, living parents, small groups, uncertain futures, and the hidden chance that one life can carry more history than anyone around it could see. In a world of small groups, ancestry does not move like a smooth river. It can move like water passing through narrow stones, changing shape because the passage is tight. Modern people are used to large numbers. A city can hold more lives than many ancient regions may have held across wide stretches of land. In the older human world, a group might be small enough that every birth changed its future. A few families, a handful of children, a few older adults with memory of roots and seasons, and the group was already carrying the weight of survival. If such a group became isolated, its history could grow distinct over time, not because it was trying to become a separate category, but because distance, chance, and environment kept shaping it generation after generation. Some traits could become more common simply because the people carrying them survived and had children. Other traces could disappear because a line ended quietly. In small populations, chance is not a small force. It can decide what remains. This matters deeply for the child, because a meeting between two ancient human groups would not enter a world of endless numbers. It would enter a fragile structure, where one child could carry a rare crossing that might remain visible for a time, vanish quickly, or pass forward in ways no one living then could understand. The beginning of humanity was built from such fragile structures. We often speak of populations as if they were large, stable things, but ancient populations may have expanded, shrunk, split, and nearly disappeared many times. A cold period could reduce movement. A warmer period could open roots. A disease, injury, or food shortage could weaken a small group. A successful season could allow children to survive. A meeting with another group could bring new ancestry into the next generation. None of this needed to happen often to matter. When numbers are small, a rare event can leave a strong mark, not because it is common, but because the group receiving it is small enough for the mark to be noticed later. That is why the child does not have to represent an entire world of constant contact. The child may represent something more delicate, a crossing at the edge of populations, in a place where the number of people was low, the distances were large, and the future of each line was uncertain. If a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father had a child, that child stood inside a population structure very different from ours. There were no millions of neighbours to blur the event into a vast crowd. There were small groups, nearby kin, distant strangers, and long stretches of land where no human body may have stood for days of walking. In such a world, separation could become strong because groups were far apart and few in number, but contact, when it happened, could also become meaningful for the same reason. A single crossing could bring an ancestry into a group that had not carried it before. A child born from that crossing could become a bridge, though not a bridge the child could understand. The body would simply grow, depend, hunger, sleep, and learn the world from adults. Yet inside that body, the history of two populations would no longer be only separate. It would become part of one generation. This is why the clean picture of evolution misses something important. It likes large outlines. One human group here, another there, one branch separating from another. But population history is made in smaller movements. A few people leave, a few remain. Some children survive, some do not. A group meets another at a boundary of land or season. A trace enters, fades, or continues. Over thousands of years, these small events can make the past look tangled from the modern side, even though each event may have been ordinary, quiet, and local when it happened. The child makes human evolution look wrong because the child reveals a level of history below the large names. Beneath Neanderthal and Denisovan, beneath maps and timelines, there were generations. Beneath generations, there were births. Beneath each birth, there was a meeting of two earlier lives. In a small ancient population, that meeting could become the place where a long separation touched the future. In the world of small ancient populations, a meeting did not need to be common to become important. It only needed to happen in the right place, at the right edge of time, and then continue through a child. This is difficult for the modern mind, because we are surrounded by large numbers. When one person is born today, the world barely changes in a visible way. But in a scattered Ice Age landscape, where groups were small and distances were wide, a single birth could carry a rare crossing into the future of a group. That does not mean the child would become famous, powerful, or even remembered. Most likely, the child's life would have been ordinary in the ancient sense. Hunger, warmth, sleep, growth, dependence, and the slow learning of land. Yet ordinary life is exactly where evolution happens. It does not happen above people like a separate force. It happens through bodies that survive, bodies that do not, children who grow and children whose lines end. A rare meeting between two human groups could disappear completely if the child left no descendants, or if the group later vanished. But it could also pass forward, not as a story anyone told, but as inheritance moving quietly from one generation into another. The child at the center of this question is powerful because the child makes that hidden scale visible. Large histories often depend on small passages. A population can look separate on a map for thousands of years, yet one edge of that population may touch another at a particular time. A group may seem distant when described by a name, but distance in the real world is never only measured in space. It is measured in climate, roots, animal movement, hunger, fear, and shelter. When these conditions narrow, groups that were usually apart can become close enough for contact. In a small population, that contact does not need to be repeated often before it becomes meaningful. One child can show that the boundary was crossed at least once. One child can reveal that the future did not move only through pure separation. This returns us to the beginning of humanity in a quieter way. Human origin was not made by single heroic moments. It was made by repeated fragile continuations. A child survived one season, then another. A mother lived long enough to give birth. A father belonged to a line that had endured its own long path. Adults carried knowledge that kept the young alive. Some children became adults and joined the next generation. Others vanished from the chain. Across deep time, this is how population history was built. Not as a clean theory, but as the uneven survival of real families under pressure. In such a world, a rare crossing could be swallowed by silence, or it could become a thread that later science would recognize. The child does not prove that ancient human groups were always mixing. It does not let us imagine a world where every boundary was soft. Some boundaries may have been strong for a very long time. Some groups may have rarely met. Some meetings may have failed to leave any lasting trace. But the child shows that complete separation was not the only possibility. That is enough to make the simple picture wider. The old model wants population histories to stay where they are placed. The child asks us to think in generations instead. A generation is not a line drawn from left to right. It is a living surface where the past enters the future through children. The child born from more than one ancient human history stood on that surface. In one body, the past had crossed a boundary that may have looked strong from far away. From close up, it was a human life beginning in a difficult world. That is why one child can change the meaning of hundreds of thousands of years, not by explaining everything, but by showing that even in a sparse and mostly silent world, one generation could carry a crossing large enough to make evolution look less like clean replacement and more like a history of fragile contact. Homo sapiens should enter this story slowly, not as the first light in a dark world, and not as the answer toward which all earlier life was waiting. Our ancestors were important, but they were not the only humans who had learned how to live on the earth. By the time modern humans moved across wider regions of Africa and beyond, other human histories had already been unfolding for a long time. Some had known cold landscapes. Some had lived near caves, rivers, forests, open plains and mountain edges. Some had carried children through hunger and winter before Homo sapiens arrived in those places. This is a difficult thought because the present world makes our species feel inevitable. We are the only human form still here. Our languages cover the planet. Our settlements, roads, farms, tools, machines, and memories have filled places where older humans once moved quietly in small groups. From the present, it is easy to look backward and imagine that the world was always preparing for us. But the child at the center of this question asks us to slow down before we place Homo sapiens at the center too soon. The old human world was already layered. Neanderthals had their own long history. Denisovans had their own hidden and partly unknown range. Other human populations may have left fewer traces or vanished before we could name them clearly. The earth was not empty, and the human story was not waiting in silence for one final branch. It was already alive with different bodies, different adaptations, and different ways of enduring place and time. To bring Homo sapiens into that world is not to describe a clean victory. It is to imagine our ancestors entering landscapes that may already have carried human memory. A cave may have been used before. A valley may have held older stone tools. A cold passage may have been known by another group long before modern humans came near it. A region that looked open from a distance may have contained invisible histories. Old fires, old paths, old shelters, old losses, and perhaps older meetings between human groups. The beginning of our own species was therefore not separate from a wider human beginning. Homo sapiens came from one line, but entered a world where other lines had not all disappeared. This matters because the child shows that contact among ancient human groups was not only something that happened after Homo sapiens expanded, even before our ancestors became the last humans. The older world may already have held crossings between other human histories. A Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father point toward a human landscape more complex than a simple tale of modern humans replacing everyone else. Our arrival did not create complexity from nothing. It entered complexity that was already there. The child makes that older complexity visible in a small, intimate way. One life, one body, one beginning before memory, and suddenly the deep past no longer looks like a row of isolated forms. It looks like a world in which different human groups could remain distinct and still sometimes touch. For Homo sapiens, that changes the meaning of arrival. Our ancestors did not walk into a world of empty categories. They entered regions where the land had shaped other humans, and where some of those humans had already left traces in bodies, sediments, tools, and hidden ancestry. The origin of modern humanity should therefore be held with humility. We are not outside the pattern. We are part of it. The same forces that shaped earlier groups also shaped us. Climate, movement, hunger, care, childhood, social bonds, and the need to survive long enough for another generation. The child does not make Homo sapiens less important. The child makes the older stage wider. Before our branch became the only surviving one, the human world had already been a place of separation, adaptation, and occasional contact. To understand why one child made human evolution look wrong, Homo sapiens must not be introduced as the end of the story, but as one more human line entering a world that already had other stories inside it. To say that Homo sapiens entered a world that was not empty is to change the direction of the story. It means our ancestors were not simply walking into silence. They were entering landscapes that had already been tested by other human bodies. A valley might have been crossed before by feet shaped through another history. A cave might have held smoke before a modern human ever saw its entrance. A river might have guided groups whose names would only be created long after they were gone. The old world did not announce these histories. It did not place signs on stone or warnings at the edges of territories, but the traces were there, sometimes in tools, sometimes in bone, sometimes only in the hidden record of later bodies. This makes the arrival of Homo sapiens less like a beginning from nothing, and more like entering a room where earlier voices had already faded into the walls. Our ancestors brought their own bodies, skills, memories, languages in some early form and social bonds. They carried fire, tools, children, fear, and hope through the same pressures that had shaped other humans before them. But they were not the first to face cold, hunger, distance, or the need for shelter. They were not the first to learn animal movement, to return to useful places, or to depend on one another through long childhood. The deeper human beginning was already spread across the earth in uneven ways. Some branches had been living outside Africa for long periods. Some had adapted to northern cold. Some had moved through Asia in ways we still only partly understand. Some left strong traces. Some left almost none. When Homo sapiens expanded into these wider regions, the story did not become simple contact between one modern group and one ancient group. It became entry into a layered human landscape, where different histories could overlap in space, miss each other by time, or meet in ways that left only faint marks. The child at the center of this video helps us feel that complexity before we turn everything into a story about ourselves. A child with Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry shows that the older human world already had crossings inside it. The mixing of human histories was not merely an afterthought to the rise of modern humans. It belonged to the broader pattern of ancient humanity. That matters because it prevents us from treating Homo sapiens as the only active force in the past. Our ancestors were not walking among empty shadows. They were moving among other human possibilities, some living, some declining, some perhaps already gone from certain places but still present through traces in the land or in inherited biology. To imagine this carefully, think of a cold valley at the edge of a season. One group has known it for generations. Another arrives because animals have shifted. A third may have passed through long before, leaving stone flakes under sediment. No one living there needs to understand the full history of the place. They only need to survive the day, protect the young, keep fire alive, and decide when to move again. Yet from the view of deep time, that valley is not empty. It is layered with use, absence, return, and possible contact. This is the kind of world Homo sapiens entered. Not a clean stage, but a history already in motion. The origin of our species cannot be fully separated from that wider human world, because our ancestors became who they were in relation to landscapes that had also shaped others. Sometimes relation may have meant avoidance, sometimes competition, sometimes brief awareness from a distance, sometimes contact close enough to leave descendants. We should not make the evidence say more than it can. We do not know every encounter. We do not know every feeling, every fear, every boundary, or every act of recognition, but we can say that the earth was not waiting empty. The child makes that clear in a quiet way. Before Homo sapiens became the only surviving human form, the planet held a human world with older depth, hidden crossings, and histories that did not vanish neatly when our own story became dominant. If a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father could have a child, then the world around Homo sapiens was not only complicated after our ancestors entered it, it was already complicated before them. That is the quiet shift this child creates. The old human world was not a line of empty rooms, one closing before the next opened. It was a landscape where different human histories could exist near one another, miss one another, avoid one another, and sometimes meet. Homo sapiens later became the only surviving human form, but survival at the end can make the past look simpler than it was. From where we stand now, the other human groups are gone, and absence makes them seem like earlier stages. But when they were alive, they were not stages. They were living populations with children, elders, shelters, roots, hunger, fear, memory, and bodies shaped by long time. The child with Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry reminds us that before our own branch became dominant, the wider human family had already been moving through a world of crossings. Some of those crossings may have happened without Homo sapiens being present at all. That matters because it removes our species from the center of every question. It tells us that human complexity did not begin only when modern humans spread outward. The complexity was older. It belonged to the land, to climate, to small groups, to shared ancestry, and to the fact that different human forms were never as simple as separate names in a book. A child born from two ancient human histories shows that the world before and around Homo sapiens was not a clean contest between one future winner and several fading forms. It was a living system of populations under pressure. Some were close enough to leave traces in one another. Some may have remained distant. Some disappeared before their stories could be known. Some survive in science only through fragments, teeth, tools, or genetic signals. This wider view brings us closer to the beginning of humanity, because it asks us to think of origin not as purity, but as relationship. Every human line came from earlier life. Every human group carried a deeper shared root. Every generation was shaped by where bodies could go, who they met, who they avoided, and which children survived. Homo sapiens did not step outside these rules. Our ancestors were also made by movement, care, danger, and chance. They entered regions where other humans had already learned how to live. They may have met some of them. They may have inherited from some. They may have competed with some, ignored some, or arrived after others had already gone. The child does not give a full map of these events, but the child changes the frame. If Neanderthals and Denisovans had already crossed histories in at least one young body, then the old human world was more woven before Homo sapiens became the last thread still visible. That thought does not reduce our importance. It makes our importance more honest. We are not the simple goal of a ladder. We are the surviving result of a wider and mostly vanished human landscape. Many lives came before us that were not trying to become us. They were trying to live through the next cold night, the next hunger, the next movement across difficult ground. The child makes human evolution look wrong because the common picture often begins with separation and ends with us. But the older reality may have included separations that later touched, histories that crossed without leaving full stories, and children who carried more than one past inside a single body. By the time Homo sapiens rose to become the only remaining human species, the human world had already been marked by hidden meetings. The child is one of those marks. Not a complete answer, not a final explanation, but a reminder that the road to us passed through a world that was never only ours. There is a quiet danger in this story, and it begins with our own imagination. When the evidence becomes small, the mind wants to make it large. A fragment becomes a face. A genetic trace becomes a scene. A child becomes a voice, a name, a memory, a sorrow, a symbol. This is understandable, because human beings do not like emptiness in a story. We want the past to return with warmth. We want to know how the child looked, whether the child was loved, whether the mother stayed near, whether the father belonged to the same group, whether people around them noticed difference, fear, kinship, or belonging. But the deep past does not give those answers easily. The child at the center of this question does not tell us a name. The child does not tell us a language. The child does not tell us the sound of the cave, the exact shape of the firelight, the feeling between the parents, or the meaning the group may have given to that young life. Those things may have existed powerfully for the people who lived then, but they have not survived in a form we can read. To speak honestly about ancient humanity, we must let some parts remain silent. This does not make the story weaker. It makes the story more truthful. The child's importance does not depend on invented scenes. It depends on the careful fact that one ancient body carried evidence of more than one human history. That is enough. The rest must be approached slowly, as possibility, not certainty. When we imagine the beginning of humanity, we have to remember how much has been lost. Most bodies did not become fossils. Most shelters did not preserve their traces clearly. Most children vanished completely from the record. Most fears, songs, gestures, griefs, and ordinary nights left no lasting mark. A group may have lived for generations in a valley and left almost nothing that can be recognized. A child may have been carried through cold seasons, fed by tired adults, protected from danger, and remembered for a time by those who loved or knew that life, and yet to us there is only silence. The origin of human beings is therefore not only a story of discovery. It is also a story of disappearance. What we know rests inside a much larger darkness. That darkness should not be filled too quickly. The child asks us to be patient with what cannot be known. We can say that the body points toward a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. We can say that this challenges an overly clean picture of separated branches. We can say that ancient human groups may have met under certain conditions shaped by land, climate, movement, and small population size. But we cannot say what the child was called. We cannot say what the child believed. We cannot say whether the child felt different, or whether anyone nearby understood ancestry in a way even remotely like ours. We cannot turn the child into a modern character, wearing ancient skin. That would make the story easier, but less honest. The older human world deserves a slower kind of respect. It was real before it became evidence. The people in it were not waiting to become examples. They were living through hunger, sleep, injury, care, weather, and dependence. They had inner lives, but those inner lives are mostly gone from us. This is the hard balance of deep history. We must not reduce ancient people to data, but we must also not pretend that data gives us a full human biography. The child stands between those two mistakes. Too little imagination turns the child into a sample. Too much imagination turns the child into fiction. A truthful story must walk between them. It can place the child back into cold land, small groups, and the fragile chain of generations. It can show why that life matters for the shape of human evolution, but it must leave the unknowns open. In that openness, the child remains more real, not less. A real ancient life does not need every missing detail supplied by us. It only needs us to listen carefully to what the evidence can say, and just as carefully to what it cannot. To tell this story honestly, 3 kinds of knowledge have to be kept apart. There is what the evidence can show with strength. There is what the evidence allows us to infer with care, and there is what remains beyond reach. When those 3 are mixed together, deep history becomes too smooth, and the child becomes less real. The strongest part of the story is the biological signal. The child's ancestry points to a mother from a Neanderthal population and a father from a Denisovan population. That is not a scene from imagination. It is a conclusion drawn from ancient genetic evidence, and it is the center of why the child matters. It shows that 2 ancient human histories, separated enough for us to name them differently, were still close enough in life for a child to be born. From there, careful inference can begin, but only slowly. If a child had parents from 2 ancient groups, then some kind of contact must have happened between living people. If that contact happened, then their worlds must have overlapped in space, time, or social circumstance. If their worlds overlapped, then land, movement, climate, shelter, food, and small population size may have shaped the chance of meeting. These are reasonable thoughts because human bodies cannot meet outside place and time, but they are not the same as knowing the whole story. We do not know the exact moment. We do not know the relationship between the parents. We do not know whether their groups lived near each other for a longer period or whether the meeting was rare and brief. We do not know whether the child grew up among one group, both groups, or in a situation we would not know how to name. The beginning of humanity is full of such limits, because most of the living texture has vanished. A tool can remain after the hand is gone. A bone can remain after the voice is gone. DNA can remain after memory is gone. Each trace is precious, but each trace is partial. The danger is to make the partial trace behave like a complete witness. A cave layer can tell us that someone was present, but not every reason for being there. A stone tool can tell us that a sharp edge was made or used, but not every thought behind the hand. Ancient DNA can tell us about ancestry, but not the emotional world of the people who carried it. This distinction matters because the child is powerful enough without decoration. The truth does not need to be made louder. A young life from a vanished human world, carrying ancestry from 2 ancient populations, is already enough to disturb the clean picture of evolution. It is enough to ask whether the branches were sometimes connected by hidden crossings. It is enough to make Homo sapiens appear not as the only meaningful line, but as one surviving line inside a wider human family. What it cannot do is give us permission to invent certainty where there is only silence. Maybe contact happened at the edge of a range. Maybe it happened near a cave or valley that drew different groups through the same region. Maybe climate made movement more likely. Maybe small population size made a rare crossing more visible in one body. These are careful possibilities, not final answers. They help us think, but they should never pretend to replace evidence. In sleep audio about ancient life, this honesty is especially important, because the slow voice can make uncertain things feel certain if they are spoken too smoothly. The listener should be allowed to rest inside mystery without being misled. The child's story is not weaker because some doors remain closed. It is stronger because the open doors are real. One door opens onto ancestry. Another opens onto contact. Another opens onto the limits of our diagrams. Beyond them, many rooms stay dark. That darkness is part of the truth. The old human world was larger than the evidence that survived, and the child reminds us that a careful question can be more honest than a complete answer. The limits of the child's story are not empty spaces to be rushed through. They are part of the lesson. In deep history, silence is not failure. It is the condition under which almost all ancient lives reach us. A few traces survive, and around them stretches a much larger world that cannot be fully recovered. This can feel frustrating, because the mind wants the child to become clear. It wants a face, a day, a family scene, a complete life. But if we force that clarity too quickly, we lose the thing that makes the story valuable. We stop listening to the evidence and begin listening to ourselves. The child asks for a different kind of attention. A small fragment, a genetic signal, a cave in a cold region, and the knowledge of two ancient human histories meeting in one young body are enough to change the question. They do not need to become a full biography. They do not need to be dressed in invented certainty. The educational value lies in learning how to stand close to the unknown without pretending it has disappeared. That is also a lesson about human origin itself. Our beginning was not preserved for us like a book left open on a table. It was scattered through sediments, bones, tools, genes, landscapes, and absences. Most of it is gone. What remains must be handled with care, because every surviving trace carries the weight of many lost lives around it. The child is one visible point in a vast darkness, and that point matters more when we do not exaggerate it. It tells us that Neanderthal and Denisovan histories could meet closely enough for a child to exist. It suggests that the old human world contained contact as well as separation. It shows that a simple tree of evolution may be too clean to hold every crossing. But it does not tell us how common such crossings were in every region. It does not tell us how people understood one another. It does not tell us whether the child's life continued long enough to matter socially to the group, or whether that young body became part of future generations. A careful story keeps those boundaries visible. This kind of care is not cold. It is a form of respect. Ancient people were real before they became evidence, and they should not be turned into decoration for our curiosity. When we admit what cannot be known, we leave room for their reality to remain larger than our imagination. We also protect the listener from a false sense of certainty. In the story of human evolution, certainty is powerful only when it is earned. Uncertainty is not weakness when it is honest. It reminds us that science grows by separating what is known from what is hoped, what is measured from what is imagined, and what is possible from what is proven. The child made human evolution look wrong not by giving us every answer, but by making a better question unavoidable. How many other lives once sat at the edges between groups and vanished without preservation? How many crossings left no trace that survived? How many ancient children carried histories that would have unsettled our diagrams if only their bodies had endured long enough to be read? These questions are not invitations to invent, they are invitations to humility. The less we have, the more carefully we should speak. The smaller the trace, the slower the story should become. A child from the deep past does not need us to make the world dramatic. The world was already difficult, fragile, and vast. The child only asks us to notice that the human beginning was wider than our neatest pictures, and that truth can sometimes arrive not as a complete answer, but as a small surviving sign that teaches us how much has been lost. The child did not make evolution wrong. Nature was not confused. The ancient world did not break its own rules because one young body carried more than one human past. The unease belongs to us, to the picture we inherited, repeated, simplified, and trusted because it made the deep past easier to hold. We wanted ancient humanity to move in clean directions. One group separates, another group appears. One kind fades, another takes its place. A branch divides and stays divided. A line moves forward until it reaches the familiar shape of modern humans. But the child asks us to return to the ground, where no line was ever that smooth. In the living world, evolution was not a drawing. It was cold air entering lungs. It was hunger shaping movement. It was parents carrying histories in their bodies without knowing those histories as science. It was small groups trying to keep children alive in landscapes that changed faster than memory could sometimes explain. When we say the child made human evolution look wrong, the truer meaning is that the child made a narrow model feel wrong. The child showed that our idea of separation had become too hard, too final, too far from the living pressures that shaped ancient people. Difference was real. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not the same population under two names. Their histories had diverged. Their bodies and ranges were shaped through long time. But a long separation does not always create an absolute wall. It can create distance, distinctiveness, and deep difference, while still leaving the possibility that, under certain conditions, living people may meet again. This is the lesson the child carries without speaking. Human evolution may have included branches but also crossings. It may have included isolation, but also moments of nearness. It may have included populations becoming different, while still remaining close enough in the wider human family for ancestry to pass across a boundary. That thought brings the whole story back to the beginning of humanity. Our origin was not a pure line protected from contact. It was a long unfolding of bodies through land and time. From the earliest human relatives to later ancient populations, survival depended on movement, reproduction, care, and the chance that the next generation would continue. A child is where all of those forces become visible. A child is new but never empty of the past. A child begins after many older lives have already moved, suffered, adapted, met, separated, and disappeared. In this one young body, the past does not look like a ladder. It looks like inheritance from more than one direction. That does not mean every ancient human boundary was open. It does not mean the old world was a simple mixture. It does not mean we can erase the names, the differences, or the long histories of separate populations. The child teaches something more careful than that. The child shows that separation and connection can exist in the same story. A population can be distinct and still not be sealed forever. A landscape can keep groups apart and later bring them close. A model can be useful and still fail when it forgets the softness of real life. The mistake was not evolution. The mistake was imagining evolution as if it preferred clean endings. Nature does not need its histories to fit our diagrams. It only carries forward what survives, changes, meets, and continues. The child stands quietly against the comfort of a straight road, not with a full answer, but with a presence that asks the road to widen. Perhaps this is why the question feels so human. We also come from histories we did not choose, from meetings we cannot remember, from generations whose names are gone but whose traces remain inside us. The child from the ancient world makes us look again, not only at Neanderthals and Denisovans, but at our own habit of wanting the past to be simpler than it was. The child's story leads to a lesson that is quieter than victory and deeper than replacement. Human beings did not begin as a pure line moving safely through time. No living population begins that way. Every group comes from earlier groups, and every generation carries what happened before it, whether the people living through it understand that history or not. In the deep past, the human world was made from separation, but also from contact. It was made from distance, but also from return. It was made from bodies that changed under cold, hunger, landscape, and time, but also from bodies that sometimes came close enough for ancestry to cross a boundary. That is why the child matters beyond one cave, one fragment, or one ancient family. The child reminds us that origin is not the same as purity. Origin is relationship. A body begins where earlier lives meet. A population continues where children survive. A species becomes visible to us only after countless smaller stories have already happened and vanished. When we imagine the beginning of humanity as clean and separate, we may feel more certain, but we also lose something true. We lose the living texture of small groups under pressure. We lose the way land shapes movement. We lose the way climate can make distance change. We lose the quiet fact that ancient people were not symbols of categories, but living beings trying to endure the next season. The child brings those truths back together. A Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father were not two labels in a chart. They were two lives from long histories, meeting somewhere inside a world of stone, cold, shelter, hunger, and movement. Their child was not an argument. Their child was a beginning, fragile and ordinary, yet carrying a history that later made our simple model feel incomplete. This is the educational value of the story. It teaches that evolution is not a ladder of improvement and not a story written for our comfort. Evolution is descent with change, shaped by environment, chance, survival, reproduction, and time. In humans, it also becomes a story of care, because every child begins helpless. The earliest human future always depended on adults protecting the young long enough for the next generation to continue. That means human evolution was never only about strong bodies or clever tools. It was also about dependence, kinship, shelter, shared knowledge, and the ability of small groups to carry memory across dangerous landscapes. A child with more than one ancient ancestry makes that lesson clearer. The past did not move only through boundaries. It moved through generations. Boundaries mattered, but they were not always permanent walls. Difference mattered, but it did not always prevent connection. Loss mattered too. Most ancient human lives left no trace that can be read. Most crossings, if they happened, disappeared completely. Whole populations may have faded without leaving a clear name, a clear face, or a clear path back to them. What remains is only a small part of what once lived. This should make the story gentler, not louder. It should make certainty slower. The child teaches humility because one small life can reveal a hidden crossing, while also reminding us that almost everything around that life is gone. To learn from such a child, we do not need to turn the ancient world into a dramatic myth. We need to let it be complex. We need to accept that human history may include mixture without becoming simple, separation without becoming absolute, and survival without becoming destiny. Homo sapiens did not rise from a clean road untouched by others. Our species emerged within a wider human family, much of which has disappeared. The child asks us to look at that vanished family with care, not as failed versions of us, not as shadows waiting to be replaced, but as real human relatives, whose lives helped reveal the true shape of our beginning. So the story returns to the child, not as an answer that closes everything, but as a small light left at the edge of a much larger darkness. One young life from an ancient world carried a truth that no one living then could have named in scientific words. The child belonged to parents, to a group, to a place, to hunger, warmth, danger, and sleep. Yet the same body also belonged to histories far older than its own breath. A Neanderthal line and a Denisovan line, separated across long stretches of time, had met closely enough for one new life to begin. That is the quiet weight of the story. It does not tell us everything. It does not give us a full map of ancient contact. It does not reveal every vanished human group or every crossing that time erased. But it does ask us to hold human evolution with more patience. A simple line can comfort the mind, but it cannot hold every movement of living bodies. A tree can show descent, but it cannot always show where branches touched again. A ladder can make the present feel important, but it can hide the lives that were never climbing toward us. The child stands against those easy shapes, not with a voice, not with a name, not with a complete memory, but with the fact of existence itself. This should leave us with a careful kind of humility. We are Homo sapiens, the only human form still alive today, but we are not the whole meaning of the human past. Before us, beside us, and around the early movements of our ancestors, there were other human relatives who lived real lives under real skies. They were not failed drafts. They were not mistakes waiting to disappear. They were parts of a wider human family, shaped by land, climate, chance, care, and time. Some of their traces remain in bones, some remain in tools, some remain in ancient DNA. Some may have vanished completely. The world that made us was larger than the world that survived into memory. That is why one child can feel so important. The child does not make evolution collapse. The child makes our imagination stretch. It asks whether we have mistaken neatness for truth. It asks whether our deepest beginning was less like a clean road and more like a landscape crossed by faint paths, some ending, some turning back, some meeting briefly before disappearing into silence. It asks whether being human has always meant carrying more than one kind of past, even when we cannot see it. There is also a gentler lesson here, one that reaches beyond ancient DNA. Every person begins as a child who does not know the histories inside the body. None of us chooses the generations that came before us. None of us remembers the hands that kept distant ancestors alive, the landscapes they crossed, the losses they endured, or the meetings that made later lives possible. We live at the surface of a very deep inheritance. The child from the ancient cave reminds us that origin is not a single point behind us. It is a long chain of dependence, contact, separation, survival, and disappearance. Much of it is gone, and yet some of it remains quietly inside the living world. To tell this story truthfully, we must let the ending stay open. The child changed the shape of the question, but not by giving a final answer. The child showed that human evolution was wider than the simple picture, softer than a hard boundary, and more woven than a single line. Somewhere in the deep past, two ancient histories met, and a child began. From that small beginning, the old picture of evolution became less certain, and perhaps more human. But if one child could reveal one hidden crossing, how many other human stories were carried for a moment, then lost forever, before anyone could learn what they meant?